All right, welcome to another edition of our Sunday Night Live at 5. Tonight we're going to talk about trauma bonds. And what I like to say is you're not addicted to the person, you're addicted to the pattern. Okay? And this term gets thrown out a ton, right? And everyone's like, "Oh, I'm trauma bonded with this person." And we don't really understand what a trauma bond is. Just because there is the word trauma in something that some way that you are relating to another person does not mean the word trauma bond should be used in that term. All right. I'm fine with you guys using different terms for different things. I got it. But when it comes to things that are clinical diagnoses, I don't want people to just be throwing things out there. That's why we did the one on narcissism. If you don't really understand what narcissism is, you should not be calling somebody a narcissist, especially if they've never been diagnosed that. That is not fair to them. And it shows, in my opinion, a lack of intelligence on your part to sit down and actually understand what's going on. You want something to fit so badly, so you just make it fit. And we do this a lot with trauma bond. So we're going to kind of dive into what it really is. Right. I want to make sure that we identify what the markers of a trauma bond. Right. We're going to clarify some misconceptions, and we're going to distinguish between what is trauma bonding and what is like mutual dysfunction, what is codependency, because a lot of times people are codependent, but they're saying it's a trauma bond. Sometimes we have mutual dysfunction and we're calling it a trauma bond, and it is not a trauma bond. And I want to make sure that that distinction is very, very clear, so that way people can understand the difference, because the way we would approach healing from a trauma bond is very different from mutual dysfunction. There are different markers on what's going on and what we need to do internally to be able to process through, learn to change our behaviors. In both those cases, it's going to be a different pattern that we are trying to break. So we need to understand which one it is, so that way I can go after it. And the reason I always say that we have to be very careful about what words we use, because if you go to a therapist and you say I'm trauma bonded, the way they're going to approach that is going to be very different from I'm mutually dysfunctional with somebody. And it's like if you go to the doctor and you say I have a headache, he's going to give you one medicine. But if you say your foot is aching, there's going to be a different medicine they're going to give for you. There's a different protocol for different things. And it's the same thing in the mental health world. So just saying I'm in a trauma bond does not actually get you the proper help that you're going to need to get out of it. So then you're going to say the therapist doesn't know what he's talking about, when in reality, you haven't been honest with him about what was really going on. So we're going to dive into that today. We're going to give you some ways to get out of trauma bonds and ways to heal. It's one of the biggest things that I do actually coach on is trauma bonding and how to kind of break that bond. So I've got some great tips and tricks on how to get past that, but I'm also going to give you some stuff on, well, it's not a trauma bond, but it's still a dysfunctional relationship of some sort. How do I heal from that? How do I recognize it? How do I get my nervous system back up? We're going to talk about all that tonight. So this should be a really great class. And it comes because 3 different people asked me what a trauma bond is this weekend. From Friday all the way through Sunday, I had people asking, what is a trauma bond? Or they're telling me they are in a trauma bond, and in doing a little bit of diving, I found they are not actually trauma bonded, right? And so I like to use the phrase, when pain feels like love, right? That's when we are trauma bonded. And it does not happen when we are bonding over trauma that we both have experienced in separate places, okay? So sometimes we bond with people not because they made us feel safe, but because the chaos felt familiar. So a lot of times when we're in trauma bonds, it is because it is familiar to something in our past, whether it be childhood, whether it be, other dysfunctional relationships. That's why abusive relationships, you get out of it and you go right back into another abusive one, because it feels familiar and it can feel like love. And a lot of times trauma bonding, the person says, I have this intense connection with the other person. Right? It's super close. I feel super connected to them. And I don't find that very often. Well, that gets us to not look at the red flags, and we go right by them, and we go right by the abuse. And we a lot of times we are going to reason and bargain away that abuse and say, well, this is true love. We were meant to be together because I've never felt this strongly for somebody. And that's the addiction type thing that a trauma bond creates. Okay. So if we want to first actually define what trauma bond is, right? Trauma bond is a psychological and emotional attachment that forms between a person and someone who repeatedly harms, manipulates, or devalues them, typically in a cycle of abuse followed by intermittent reward or relief. Okay, so let's break that down. What I want the takeaway from this definition is that there is a very clearly defined abuser and there is a very clearly defined victim in a trauma bond. It is not both people can be the victim at times, both people can be the abuser at times. That is not a trauma bond. That is mutual dysfunction. We want to make sure we have that distinction right away. But a trauma bond is one person abusing and then going the opposite way. So a lot of times, a trauma bond, we can have that with a narcissist very, very easily. We can have that with borderline personality very, very easily because they abuse us and then they're like love bombing us. And they abuse us, then they love bomb us. And they abuse us and they love bomb us. And at first glance, it seems like, this just ups and downs and waves, right? But what that abuse is actually doing chemically inside your brain is getting you addicted to the reward center of your brain and the dopamine that's coming in, right? So what we have to understand is that it is not just something that like we are psychologically, we are chemically bonded to that person because of that cycle that's gone on, right? So one of the things I do with anybody that's been trauma bonded is we have to go no contact. It's like going cold turkey with cigarettes or with anything else. I have to detox you from that chemical, right? And as hard as that is, it is the easiest way to start breaking that trauma bond is to go no contact. Don't look at pictures. We have to delete everything. If we have been trauma bonded, there is no reason to keep those pictures. There's no reason to keep the text messages. There's no reason to keep any memory that's going to bring you back. Because I guarantee, as soon as you have that memory, it's going to send you right back there. It's gonna have you pleading and fiending for that drug that you had with them, that dopamine that you were literally addicted to. Okay, so again, a trauma bond is a psychological or emotional attachment forms between someone that is an abuser and someone that is a victim. Okay, so we have to have very clearly defined abuser and victim. That's the first thing that we need to be looking for. Now, I wouldn't say it never could happen, but you technically could have a trauma bond where both are abusers and both are victims of the other person, and that would be a wicked cycle. But it typically is one person is the abuser and they're the abuser the entire time. There is no going back and forth on it, okay? Because typically that will be leading towards mutual dysfunction, where you both have some sort of issues coping with life, and it comes out in how you relate in relationships, okay? So that means that the person who hurts you is also the person who temporarily soothes whatever it is with the love bombing or whatever the case may be. So some of the core traits of what a trauma bond is: intensity mistaken for intimacy. I want you to write these down. If you got a piece of paper, please write them down. Or if you're in the replay of this tomorrow, pause it right here, get a pen and paper, and write these down. The first core trait is intensity mistaken for intimacy. Right? We feel like this rush, this crazy strong, almost we feel addicted to that person. And we think that's intimacy, but it's really not. It's intensity. And intensity and intimacy are not the same thing, but we feel like a strong pull to that person. That is not intimacy. Right? The next core trait is high emotional highs and deep emotional lows. So it's not like this even keel where like, you have problems in relationships. They're all going to be there. They're going to be waves up and down. But what we're talking about, like you feel like you're on top of the world, like I could marry this person. Then the next day you're like, oh my gosh, I hate this person. I can't believe I'm stuck on this person. Those highs and lows like that should not exist in a relationship. We should have little ones like that. But when it's extremes, then that usually typically starting to send that maybe we're in a trauma bond. Okay. Another one is repeated breakups and reconciliations. That one's pretty common. Now, again, any one of these by itself does not state trauma bond. We kind of have to have all of these core traits, right? We have to have the abuser and we have to have the victim, very clearly defined. Then we have to have intensity mistaken for intimacy, high emotional highs, deep emotional lows, repeated breakups and reconciliations, deep loyalty despite ongoing harm. Right? We are staying loyal, and a lot of times that loyalty comes out in a form of defense. So let's say we're with a partner that's abusive towards us, and our friends or our family see it. And our friends and our family, the first thing that they're going to say is, this is going on. And what do? We jump to their defense. Oh, you just don't understand. He's been through so much, or she's been abused, and I've just got to love her. I've got to accept that part of her. We start bargaining and reasoning and defending that person to our friends and family a lot of times. So that's another good sign that we are in that. Now, when this gets to an extreme, we get to Stockholm syndrome, which typically happens with like abductors and things like that, where a child gets abducted and they're abused from their abductor the whole time. And by the time they actually get separated, they actually have the attachment is so strong that they have massive problems after getting reunited with family after they get taken from their back from their abductor. So that's Stockholm. That's even worse. That's a trauma bond to like the extreme, right? Because in that kind of trauma bond, we're going to defend our abuser 1,000 times over and say, oh, that you don't understand, you weren't there and all this stuff, when in actuality, the abuse was absolutely terrible. And we're doing that because we're afraid we're not going to get our drug again, that dopamine. We are literally addicted to that person because of the way the ups and downs have been going. That causes that dopamine addiction, right? If we don't have massive ups and downs, it's just this kind of like little bit of waves. We don't have that intense connection. A lot of times, people that have been in abusive relationships won't stay in the next relationship because they're like, oh, it's just boring, because they don't have those ups and downs. And that's why I say it's easy to go from one trauma bond to another, because we get out of it and it feels familiar going to the next one because we're looking for that up and down. And we are mistaking that anxiety that we feel in our gut as butterflies. That anxiety is your nervous system telling your body that you are unsafe at this time. And it may be the person and it may be a pattern from our past, but we've got to understand this stuff before we can understand what's really going on when we attach to another human being. Okay. The last one on there for the core traits is shame, self-blame, or guilt for wanting to leave, right? Like, they need me. A lot of times we know that they're abusive, right? And we say, well, they're going to collapse without me. All I need to do is love them. Those kinds of like guilty. If we leave, we're going to put them in a hole and we're going to hurt them. We don't want to be that person, right? And so if we look at all of that, that is what actually defines a trauma bond. Now, with that, with all these little things in there, you can see that if there's a clear abuser and a clear victim, that it kind of takes out a lot of the other types of dysfunction that we have. Somebody that is straight manipulative is not on a trauma. You're not on a trauma bond with them. It can develop into a trauma bond. Mutual dysfunction can develop into a trauma bond, but at its surface level, those things are not trauma bonds. Okay. So let's go over what a trauma bond is not. We've now talked about kind of what is a trauma bond, right? So some common misconceptions about what a trauma bond is not: a relationship with poor communication, conflict, emotional baggage, where both parties are willing to heal. Okay. Typically in a trauma bond, the one person that's the abuser does not want to heal. They don't see themselves as a problem. They put everything on the other person. Everything that the other person is doing, I'm not making you do it. You're doing it and you're hurting me, and I'm not responsible for my behavior and how I'm reacting to you. Right? That's typically how a trauma bond looks. So if both parties have all sorts of massive problems within the relationship, yet they're saying, look, I'm willing to heal and fix this, and I want to go forward with you, and I want to learn, then that is not a trauma bond. Okay. Next one, a connection where your partner triggers old wounds, but also takes ownership and grows with you. That is not a trauma bond, right? Just because somebody triggers you and then you get through that trigger, right? Now you feel stronger and bonded to that person. You didn't bond because of the trauma of the trigger, right? That is not a trauma bond, right? And that one gets talked about a lot. Like when someone's triggering you a lot, everyone's like, oh, it's a trauma bond with this person. No, it's not a trauma bond. Like, that's actually healthy to have somebody trigger you, them stay and work through it with you. You grow together and you end up stronger on the other side. That's not a trauma bond. That's how bonding actually happens. We can't bond with other human beings if there's no struggle to face together to overcome. So we have to understand that triggers are going to have to be there in order to heal. Like, one of the things I talk about all the time in trying to heal from abusive relationships is I have to be triggered. I have to be triggered by the same trigger over and over so many times, and I have to continue to practice how I get past that trigger before we can get anywhere. You can ask a question about it, but I ask that you wait till I ask for questions, because if I continue to ask or answer questions, I'll never get finished with the class. So I want to make sure I get all the information out here. Okay, another thing that a trauma bond is not is a codependent dynamic without abuse or manipulation, right? Codependency, if you remember back to that one, it's where we are using the other person to prop ourselves up, okay? And we can have mutually codependent, where both people are codependent on the other person, but we're using the other person to regulate our emotions. That is codependency. So if we have codependency, but we have no abuse and no manipulation, no gaslighting, no name calling, no nothing, okay, no emotional abuse, then we do not have a trauma bond, right? There has to be abuse between the two people. That means that, when we have a relationship, right? Like, so for someone like me, I've been in an abusive relationship. If I get in a relationship with somebody else that has been in an abusive relationship and we bond over our shared traumas that we have gone through, that does not make that a trauma bond. Okay, that is not, even though we may be relating to each other and we still have bad communication and we have like fights and stuff, that doesn't mean I'm trauma bonded because we are not abusing each other, right? That is not abuse. That can be, I'm emotionally unstable and I don't know how to deal with it, which makes me dysfunctional. And then that means that we might both be emotionally dysfunctional. So that might be happening. But what a trauma bond is definitely not two people that have been through traumatic experiences coming together in one relationship and now we're bonded over the same type of trauma. It's not a trauma bond. Logically, it may seem like that's what we would define it as because we both have trauma. We're bonding over that trauma. So it's a trauma bond. Trauma bond is always got one abuser and one victim. That's the premise of it, okay? Now, another trauma bond one that people ought to say is a painful breakup or emotional attachment to someone who simply disappoints you, right? Over and over and over again. That's not a trauma bond. Just because you break up and go back together, and it's painful every single time, does not mean it's that. Because again, without the abuser and the victim, without actual emotional abuse, it is not. Now, I will say that if it's a pattern, right, of breakup and reconciliation thousands of times, like micro ones, like, even in like a week's time, you've broke up 3 times and got back together 3 times. If that happens over a period of months, then yes, you're going to end up, that is the abuse. The breaking up is the actual abuse. The breaking up and reconciliation is the high and the low and the high and the low and the high and the low. So it can be that way. And that only happens, though, if one person is the one that continually breaks up and comes back and breaks up and comes back and breaks up and comes back over a very long period of time. So it can be abusive. But again, I have to have a very clear long-term pattern that is causing that. Okay. So again, poor communication, conflict, emotional baggage, that's not considered a trauma bond. Connection where your partner triggers you and you have to get over it, that's not a trauma bond. Codependent dynamic without abuse, not a trauma bond. Painful breakup, not a trauma bond. Relationship where the bond over shared trauma, not a trauma bond. I want to make sure that we're very clear about those things because that is probably the biggest misconception is two people that have bonded over trauma that they've had in their past, then they're trauma bonded. It's not a trauma bond. Okay. Again, we have to have abuse in between the two people currently, otherwise it is not. Now, we can have what looks like abuse when we have mutual dysfunction, when both people are just not understanding how to communicate properly, we're lashing out, getting defensive. We may even have like emotional immaturity, so we don't know what words to use, so we lash out. All of those things are not necessarily abusive. They may look like it at face value, but again, it's always the intent behind it. If their intent behind what they're saying and doing is to protect themselves, that's not, it may look abusive, but it's not. Abuse has to come from the intent on actually harming the other person, punishment, those kinds of things, right? I mean, it can feel abusive, but at its core, it's not. It's kind of like when somebody's manipulative at the core, what are they trying to do? Are they on purpose trying to manipulate us? Or are they doing it out of self-protection, right? If their intent is to harm you, to control and manipulate you, then yes, they're probably getting closer to a narcissist at that point, if that makes sense at all. So as we've gotten through that, now I'll stop and ask, does anybody have any questions right now about what we've gone over so far about what a trauma bond is and what a trauma bond is not? I'll give you about 2 or 3 minutes to ask questions, and then we'll move on to how a trauma bond forms and then how do we get past it afterwards. This topic, man, I'm telling you, I'm finding more and more people that have been in trauma bonds and didn't even know it. That's the scary part is a lot of times people don't realize what a trauma bond is, and then they don't realize how hard it is afterwards. And when we talk abuse, And this is coming from someone that's been physically and emotionally abused in the same relationship. I got over the physical stuff. I could care less about the physical stuff that she did to me. But what I do care about is the emotional toll that it took on me. It's harder to come back from that emotional manipulation and gaslighting than it is to come back from the physical stuff. The physical stuff, it hurts, yes, but I get over it. And I almost can understand it as a human being. You know, when you get that frustrated, you get to that point, you may do something like that. But in all honesty, the emotional side is much harder to deal with. It doesn't look like we've got any questions, even though I know some people were asking for them. So we're just going to go ahead and move on here to how trauma bonds form. Okay, so when it comes to how they form, it's intermittent reinforcement's the first one, right? The relationship swings unpredictably between harm and relief. The inconsistency hooks your nervous system into craving the next good moment. So you're just waiting for things to get better, right? You're like, okay, well, once this happens, it'll get better. Or you're waiting for them to finally give in and come back to you, whatever the case may be. That's your nervous system craving that person. And that intermittent reinforcement is what truly creates the drug addiction. Okay. I got the question here now. So what does it mean they abuse the trigger against the I'm not sure. Can you reword that? Because that question doesn't really make sense. So reword that, we'll come back to it. Emotional starvation followed by an occasional reward. Okay. You're emotionally deprived, then rewarded with a text, an apology, and some sort of affection, creating dependency on brief relief from the chaos. Okay. Like you might be fighting with the person and they're like, look, I'm sorry. Right. It's not a full 4-part apology like we've talked about in the past, but they apologize. And it's almost like you can feel your shoulders relax. You're like, okay, they get it. They understand. They didn't even give you a real apology. They're just saying, I'm sorry to get you to do that. So they provide the relief, but that's not actual relief. Okay. The next one is trauma repetition and familiarity. If your love felt unsafe in childhood, chaos now feels normal. The dysfunction feels like home. So that trauma bond is going to form with anybody that is going to have patterns that seem very similar to childhood, if that makes sense. Going back up, the question was, they keep using triggers for the raise of the mood. I think what you're trying to say is they trigger you on purpose. If they are triggering you on purpose, they know it's a trigger, then it 100% is abuse at that point. Because again, it's intent. If their intent is to rile you up, to dysregulate you so that way you make a bad decision or you back off of whatever claim that you have, that is abuse. That is manipulation, and they are using your triggers against you, right? Inadvertently, them triggering you on something that they didn't know, that's not a problem. But when they trigger you and you tell them, hey, this is a trigger, like, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that, and then they do it again and again and again and again and again, and then they use it in specific moments, that is abuse. 100% that is manipulation, and that is abuse, okay? Another reason why trauma bonds form, or how they form, is nervous system confusion. Your body can't distinguish between intensity and intimacy. I talk about it in my new book, Trigger Control, that the body doesn't know the difference between bullet and betrayal. Okay. So if it's putting us in dysregulation, we can't tell the difference. So when it comes to the intensity versus intimacy, we cannot tell the difference. Our brain cannot distinguish. We have to tell it what's intimacy and what's intensity. But again, if we didn't know that, then we're just going to lump both of them in together. So the nervous system gets very, very confused, right? We begin confusing pain for passion and adrenaline for love, right? Adrenaline for love is like that exhilarating, like we get that adrenaline is going to give you butterflies in the stomach. So when the nervous system goes into the sympathetic side, which is the side that is the fight or flight side, it shuts off digestion. Okay. When digestion, if you've got food in your stomach and digestion shuts off, it's going to feel like little butterflies in your stomach. And it may even feel like cramps. If you haven't eaten in a while and you end up in fight or flight, you're going to feel cramps because our digestive system shuts off because the body is trying to say, I need to use all of my energy in order to fight whatever it is that's about to come. So when we get activated, we feel butterflies. We're like, oh my gosh, this person makes me feel amazing. What they're not making you feel amazing in any way, shape, or form. What they're doing is triggering your nervous system. And your nervous system, without you knowing it, is recognizing a pattern in this person. What it is seeing in this other person is that the last time this pattern happened, I was hurt, I was betrayed, I was heartbroken, whatever the case may be. So now your brain equates whatever they just did to a pattern that you have seen in the past. And our subconscious mind is going to see that, pick up on it, and it's going to understand that we have a problem here. And that's why it activates our nervous system. So it's very, very important for us to understand that when our nervous system gets activated, we should not be making decisions in that moment. We should be disengaging, because even though a lot of people are like, oh, you can't stay and stay in the fight and try to work this out. This is a bad time to do that, because now if they're poking you to do that, they are now taking advantage of you, because they're not respecting your autonomy, that you know yourself well enough to say, I cannot function in a logical state right now. I need to back out of this for a short period of time. I need to reset my nervous system and get into a logical place before I can have a conversation with you. And abusers are very, very good at knowing when they've dysregulated you, and they poke harder. They try to bait you into staying in the conversation. And this is where, like, you'll be like, look, I need to take a pause. And they're like, what, we can't actually work this out right now. Now they're going to get you to make a bad decision because they know they have you dysregulated. So nervous system confusion is a big way that we get trauma bonded, because we start getting so confused that we just go with it. We don't stand up and fight for what our nervous system is telling us. We just kind of go with the flow with this person. Okay. Again, the body cannot tell the difference. So I always say, you're not addicted to the person, you're addicted to the cycle of danger and temporary safety at the end of that. Okay. Now, what are some signs that you're in a trauma bond? Okay. So if we've identified that we're with a partner that is abusive, and it's the up and down, back and forth, and that kind of flow, right? And we blame ourselves and we feel guilty and all that stuff. What are some signs, like as we start to look at it? Okay, you feel more anxious than you do safe when you're around them. Like if you're waiting for the shoe to drop, for them to yell, scream, get mad, throw things, or say something mean, like, or whatever, then that typically is saying that we have a problem. And sometimes that can come out as like, you need to tell your partner something, but you're afraid of how they're going to take it. That is telling us that we are probably sensing that we have had a pattern of abuse anytime that we have spoken up about our feelings. Now, abuse can be something is clearly just being extremely dismissive of somebody and then mean at the same time. It's one thing to dismiss somebody's feelings, but to tell them they are stupid, that they are overreacting, that they are being sensitive, that is on the borderline of where abuse starts, right? That is the gateway into actual abuse, where they start saying meaner things to you at that point. So that feeling anxious, if you're afraid to bring things up because they might get up like crazy, if you feel unsafe because you're afraid they could fly off the handle at any point and you're not sure what's going to happen, and you even find yourself people pleasing and going over and above and beyond to try to put this person on a pedestal so that way they don't react negatively, we are now anxious over trying to make sure that we take care of their feelings and their emotions, and that is not healthy, right? Another sign of it, you constantly think about them, even when you want to leave. Like if you know that they are bad for you and you're like, I can't get them off my mind, that is signaling that we are in a trauma bond. We are chemically connected to this person in our brain, because when they're not there, we are fiending, just like a cigarette smoker without a cigarette, just like a drug addict without their drug. You start to get like itchy and like, well, in the brain, the way love does that with dopamine is that we start thinking of that person, trying to figure out a way to get that person to give us some form of dopamine. And in some cases, we would rather have negative attention from that person than no attention. So we'll poke and prod that person to get some sort of attention to give ourselves some form of dopamine. So if we constantly have that person in our mind, we cannot let them go, and we're trying to scheme and figure out ways to get them back in our life, we are probably in a trauma bond with them. Okay. The next one is you fantasize about their potential while ignoring their patterns, right? And a lot of times it's not fantasizing in the sense that like we're like, oh my gosh, they're so perfect for me. No, I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is a lot of times we try to say like, well, they were really good for this period of time. So if I just get back there, if I can just get back to that point, right? We fantasize about certain specific things about the person more than anything. Okay. Those are signs that I'm ignoring all the bad stuff, right? And just going right by it because of this like one or two good things that they can do. Okay. Now, another sign is you feel relieved after every conflict is smoothed over, then guilt for ever considering leaving. Like, oh, see, what was I thinking? Why did I shouldn't have even thought about leaving. Because they came through for me. If we have that, that means that we are having this massive, when we have conflict in a healthy relationship, we're not going to have this like massive drop off at the end. We're and feeling great. Like all of a sudden the elevated level just, woof, okay, now we're good. We're back to even keel. We're not going to have that in a healthy relationship. We may have conflict and be mad and want to isolate a little bit, but we're never going to have that like extreme high, extreme low, extreme high, extreme low, right? Another big sign is we start making excuses for their harmful behavior to our friends or family. We talked about that one earlier, right? When we start jumping to their defense to people that are clearly seeing it from the outside, we have a problem because those people are seeing it from the outside. And yes, they don't see everything, but they don't need to see everything because if they can see the abuse, no matter what, that means we have a problem. And that's something a lot of people like to like they typically ignore that because they're like, "Oh, my friends and family don't see it." They don't need to see how he is when you're not around a group of people. If they can see abuse while you're in, that is not a healthy space at all, right? Okay, so a trauma bond is kind of like a slot machine. This is the kind of the ending of the whole like what it feels like to be in there, right? You keep pulling lever, hoping for a win, even though you're mostly losing. But that one good moment keeps you chasing more, right? So if you've spent every dime that you have on this slot machine and you're like looking around for quarters, because like I know if I just pull it one more time, it's gonna work, right? If we think we can love this person more and they'll suddenly change their bad behavior, we might be in a trauma bond at that point because their bad behavior has gotten us to the point where we're trying to figure out what we have to do to get them to stop their bad behavior. But at the end of the day, they have to want to stop their bad behavior. There's nothing that I'm going to say. There's nothing I'm going to do. There's no amount of love I can give that is going to stop a person from abusing me once I'm in a trauma bond with them. Okay. So we have to understand that straight away. Right. So why is it so hard to leave? Well, you believe the good version of them is who they truly are. Right. We believe that potential is going to be there. We feel guilt for leaving the relationship, right? We feel like we're going to be letting them down or hurting them or something along those lines. You've been isolated and emotionally broken down. That's why it's hard to leave. A lot of times, abusive relationships have a tendency over time to isolate you. You don't want to be around friends. Because you don't want them to see a lot of times. Or in a gaslight or a narcissistic gaslit manipulative type thing, they isolate you because then it's easier to keep you from wanting to be around friends and it's easier to control you. So in any way, shape, or form, once you've been isolated, it makes it much, much harder to get out because you don't feel like you have the support network for it. Right. Then when you fear being alone more than being mistreated, right? And that's why I say, like, eventually you get to the point where the mistreatment is so hard to hold on to that you don't fear being alone. You don't fear the silence and all those things at a later time. So we are able to walk away. Then it's also hard because your identity becomes enmeshed with this whole concept of fixing or saving them. A lot of times, and this is where once it gets to the point where it's like fixing, saving, or defending them, like you feel like you're the only person that will ever defend them, this is where it starts to borderline into Stockholm syndrome, where it gets so bad that like you feel like you're the only thing that's going to be able to fix this person and get them better. And we take on that role as a way to mitigate the abuse because we think if we're fixing it, the abuse is less. So if I just keep going, they're not going to be abusive at all if I can continue to go. Right. And that's where a lot of times we feel guilty for leaving because we're afraid that if we leave, then they'll never get the help they need. They'll never fix themselves. But in all honesty, I always say that it's better to just walk away and let them feel the consequences because I can tell my son not to put his fingers in the electrical socket all I want. And he's going to only learn when he puts that that fork in there, that knife in there, and he gets shocked. That consequence will teach him to never put it in there again. He's not going to listen to me. Right. So I can talk to that person to try to get them the help they need. They're never going to get it. They're not going to get it until they decide they can actually change. And they're only going to do that if they feel the consequence. And a lot of times us leaving is the consequence. As bad as it sounds, let them badmouth you. Let them tell you you're the problem. Don't believe it because you know that they've been the abusive one. Let them continue to talk. That's why I also say we need to go into no contact when we come out of one of these relationships because we're going to end up getting suckered in essentially at some point because when we come out, maybe the first couple days might be really hard. Then we'll start kind of swinging back up. And then if they catch us on one of those days where we're starting to kind of go back down, they're going to catch us in a weak moment and we're going to take them back. And then the cycle just starts all over again. Okay. So, how do we get out of that trauma bond? Well, the first thing is radical honesty. Stop sugarcoating the pattern. Write out what's actually happening, not what you wish was happening. So, what I tell people to do is journal and write out all the bad things this person is doing to you and write all the good things. Typically, in a trauma bond, you're going to have like about 50 to 60 things bad they're doing, and you're going to have like 5 good. A relationship really should have at least, I mean, I wish it would be better than this, but at least 50% good, 50% bad. Okay. And if they're working on that 50% bad, it'll get better in time. But what I don't want to see is a 90% bad, 10% good. We should never be staying for a 10%. I like to go off the 80-20 rule. If 80% of them is good and 20% of them is bad, I should be able to accept that 20% bad as long as it's not something that goes against one of my hard boundaries. Okay. Nervous system regulation is how you get out. Okay. So doing breath work, the 4-7-8 method, the box breathing method, the 4-6-8 method, 4-6-9 method, or just, regulated breathing in the sense of like 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. We don't have to have any crazy setup. As long as we're being intentional with our breathing, we are breathing in. We're inhaling a certain amount, but we're exhaling more than we inhale. That'll stimulate our vagus nerve. Excuse me. So breath work is very, very important. Then pairing that sometimes with cold exposure, whether it be ice cubes, squeezing them and letting them melt in our hands, cold water showers, ice baths, putting your hands in ice water, just holding them there for a couple minutes. Any of that cold exposure is going to help to regulate our nervous system. Because again, if the nervous system is confused, this is what helps it go back to a logical state, okay? Long walks, movement definitely helps. So get out of the house, take a dog for a walk, just go walk around the block, things like that. Get everything moving, because what everyone always says, movement's what helps. I get it that movement helps. What actually happens is while you're moving, your body naturally has to breathe in a more graded rate. It has to be in a actual, like thought out process of breathing. So it automatically helps you start to breathe better. But the movement does help for a few different reasons, okay? Trauma-informed therapy or somatic work are other ways that we can do it, and that uses things like flexation and relaxation. There's a couple other techniques that we can use in somatic work, stretching the psoas muscle, things like that. But something to regulate your nervous system. That's the next part you want to do. So radical honesty, nervous system regulation, and then we want to be emotionally detaching, because that part comes first, right? So emotional detachment means that this is where I talk about no contact. If I want to break that trauma bond, no contact, block them. I'm not the person that blocks people typically, but if coming out of a traumatic relationship, I'm going to block that person for at least the first 4 to 6 weeks as I detox. I've read several studies on both ends of the spectrum on this. And some people say it's only 7 days that we are addicted to the dopamine that a person gives us. Other people say it's anywhere from 60 to even 90 days. Okay. But what I tell people is at a minimum 4 weeks, we go no contact. If we do that, typically that'll wear off and we'll start to feel better. And then we can start to at least logically go back through it. But it typically is going to be, a couple weeks at minimum that I have to go no contact and block that person and do not let them have any way into my life. And in some cases I've seen with narcissists that people have had to actually get no contact orders to do that, because we block them, and then what do? They show up at our work. They show up wherever our new house is or whatever we move into. Okay. The next part of it is using a support and safe people, right? You can't heal in isolation. Typically, when you go into isolation, it's going to put you in a circle. It's going to put you in an overthinking pattern, and you're going to have problems. Either join support groups. I've got one on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. We have support groups where anybody can come in. It's $25 a session, and we can just vent about stuff that we got going on. Those support groups, I find, are actually better sometimes than even the one-on-one coaching, because you get to see other people going through the same thing. We get to like bond over that, and we suddenly start to not feel so alone, and we actually do get past whatever it is that we're going through. And we've got other people to kind of cheer us on, like especially if they're a couple steps ahead of us and they give us little tips and things like that. If we have 5 or 6 people in a session, a couple people give different tips. You try those, and you're actually going to help you get past it. So you can't heal in isolation. Join a support group, lean on family and friends, whatever it is. that you got going on. Justin, I see you popped in here, said hi. What's going on, brother? Um, so we use that support system, okay? We need to build a new definition of love, right? So one of the big things I do in my work is a lot of self-awareness stuff with clients. So at some point I may have them define, what does love look like? What does your ideal relationship look like, right? What does ideal love feel like? And we learn how we have to repattern that, because if we look at those definitions and anything looks dysfunctional or is considered a trauma response, we have to exit that part and figure out what the opposite looks like and go from there. Okay. So that's how we get away from a trauma bond. Okay. We have that radical honesty. We regulate our nervous system. We emotionally detach and go no contact. We use support and safe people, and we redefine what our version of what love looks like. Okay. So what if I'm in a bad relationship that is still dysfunctional, but it's not a trauma bond? What do I do then? Okay, so not every unhealthy relationship is trauma bond. Sometimes you're stuck in a cycle of poor boundaries. You have unresolved attachment wounds from your previous relationships. You're afraid of being alone or starting over. You've never seen what healthy looks like. All of these can make you feel like you might be in a trauma bond, but it really, what at the end of the day, is just dysfunctional. Okay. So again, one of the things we do to get out of that is, the first thing we got to do is get brutally honest with ourselves, right? About our patterns. We need to look at why I'm choosing this type of person. We need to do that deep dive. And 90% of people don't ever actually heal because they don't they don't want to have the hard conversations internally with themselves about what's really going on. And I'm going to tell you, it's not easy to look at yourself and say, "Oh my gosh, look at all these ugly things." It's really easy to say, "Oh yeah, they abused me." It's not easy to say, "I chose it, and I chose it because I was damaged from this." It's not easy to say, "I have a problem with anything behavioral wise." It's much easier for us to just blame them as the abuser. But if we continue to blame them as the abuser, we're going to end up in another abusive relationship, because we're not fixing why we got in that abusive relationship in the first place. So we've got to get that brutal, honest part about our patterns and why we keep choosing them, right? Then we got to seek therapy to address your unmet emotional needs. So if you are dysfunctional in any way, shape, or form, which a lot of times we end up in mutually dysfunctional. So when we are two people that have had trauma, two bad relationships, okay, we end up in a relationship together and we're bonded over that. That's not a trauma bond, but we are in it. We're bonded over that. We then get in all these fights and miscommunications, and there's passive aggressiveness each direction. There's all sorts of bad behaviors on both sides. That is mutually dysfunctional. It is not a trauma bond. It is mutually dysfunctional, which means that dysfunctional comes from a lot of times unmet needs. So we go to therapy after we come out of any sort of dysfunctional relationship to understand, what needs was this person not meeting in me, right? And a lot of times, if you have the self-awareness going into a relationship and you really know what your needs are, your ancillary needs, and what your wants are and what your desires are, you're going to have a lot easier time spotting that this person is not meeting that need of yours. It's not as easy as saying, "Well, my needs are one of the 5 love languages." Those are the start of what our needs are, but there are more than that. Women that like to say touch, I'm like, okay, if it was touch, if I walked up and touched your arm, would you feel like I loved you? They'd be like, "Well, no." I'm like, "What does it take for that to feel good?" Like, "Well, I need to feel emotionally safe." Aha, there we go. So if I understand my needs, I'm going to be able to understand that this person is not meeting those needs. But I've got to do that work. I've got to go through therapy, coaching, whatever the case may be, to discover who I am and what I want and need, so that way I can figure out how this person fell short of it, and that's why it was a problem, and how do I fix that in communicating it to somebody else going up in the future, right? Another way we can fix these dysfunctional relationships is learn to set and enforce clear boundaries, right? Once we start setting clear boundaries, the relationship a lot of times will dissolve if it's dysfunctional, because we set a clear boundary and we respect ourselves enough to enforce it. That person won't like it, and then they're just going to be disrespectful, and then the relationship will slowly start to fall apart from there. And then eventually we'll end up out of it. Okay? Because a boundary isn't meant to kick somebody out unless they're disrespectful. A boundary is meant to tell a person, "I need you to respect this part of me that I need." And when they don't respect it, they actually exit themselves because they're mad because they don't get their way, which means they're the ones that are exiting the relationship. But we should never bend our boundary to keep them in the relationship. If we do, we are abandoning who we are, right? So
if we're afraid to be abandoned by that person, we don't just go turn around and abandon ourselves in order to do that, because then we're going to be unfulfilled. We're going to have resentment and all those things going forward. Okay. So, how else can we do it? Well, you evaluate, is this relationship growing or draining me? And I like to use just a very simple, like, journal thing where we list off what are they adding to my life and where are they taking away from my life, right? And a lot of times, if you say that they're adding it to your life, make sure that you're not prompting that, right? Like, oh, they add adventure. If you're the one planning every single date, every single weekend, together, everything that you do as a couple, if you're planning everything and doing everything for those adventures that you say that this person is giving to you, then it's not, you're actually mistaking what you're doing as a way for them to be doing it. So what do they add to your life? What do they subtract from your life? And when we do that, it makes it a lot easier sometimes to see that this is dysfunctional. This is just not working. And I need to get out of this, right? And if at any point in time, if the what are they taking away from my life, if peace is on there, it's time to leave that relationship. Okay. So we've got to make sure we understand those things going forward. But at the end and the core of this, okay, we have to again understand that I want to kind of recap here that a trauma bond has a person that is an abuser and a person that is a victim, and it's a cycle of high and low. So they'll break up with you and get back with you. They'll love bomb you, to get you feeling good, and then they'll abuse you by manipulating, gaslighting, something like that. Something that is intention, like the intention is to harm you. They're going to do something like that. Okay, that is a trauma bond. A trauma bond is not mutual dysfunction. A trauma bond is not codependency. A trauma bond is not bonding over similar type of trauma. That is not a trauma bond, because at that point, like, okay, if somebody else has been blown up in an explosion in Iraq, and I've been blown up in an explosion in Iraq, and we talk about it, we trauma bonded. I mean, that's what, when you take the relationship part of it out of it, and we just talk about two people walking down the street talking about the same experience they've been through, that's not, we would be trauma bonded with everybody then, because we all share a lot of similar experiences. It means that everybody that's on my page, I'm trauma bonded with. No, trauma bond has to have that abuse. That's the part that really gets everybody, is that there has to be abuse. Otherwise, it is not a trauma bond, right? So at the end of this, I want you to take away what it looks like to be in a trauma bond and what it looks like to be in dysfunctional, but also take away that we need to have radical honesty with ourselves to be able to get away from this. We have to have nervous system regulation in order to start calming ourselves down, and we need to start getting into support groups and going no contact with those individuals that have harmed us. The only way to break a trauma bond, the only way, is to go no contact. As painful as it is, you have to gut out the detox from the dopamine from that person, right? That doesn't mean you're not going to get dopamine other places, but we replace that dopamine with serotonin by looking for moments of joy. If you've seen, I have a Jeep journal specifically about how we get past that dopamine addiction, and the way we do it is we replace it with serotonin. Serotonin comes from a place of joy. The love drug is serotonin. The pleasure drug is dopamine. Dopamine is that I ding the bell and I get the treat kind of stuff. Okay. Like, that's where validation can become very, very dangerous. Like, if people are addicted to social media, a lot of times it's because they want the validation of the likes. The likes are giving them the dopamine hit. It's, I do this and I get this. I post a picture and I get thousands of likes. That's what the dopamine is. It's a reward center in the brain, whereas serotonin is not a reward center, right? This is where you might feel really good watching your son or daughter play a sport and them have a really good play. Like, there's no validation involved. You're not getting anything out of it. You have the simple joy of watching your child do something awesome, or sitting and watching them get, a honor roll certificate. That's joy. That is serotonin that's going to get released in your body. So we need to look for moments like that to replace. That's why I say self-isolation is not a good thing either, is because we can go look for things that give us joy that's going to start easing the pain of the dopamine addiction that we have now, and the fiending and the cravings that we have for that dopamine. But we can only replace it with serotonin. So we look for moments of joy, things that we don't gain anything out of, but make us happy, make us smile, make us, excited, those kinds of things. So we have to start getting better at healing after these things, but it starts with understanding the terms and not just throwing them around like they're a football. Okay. So now that you've been through this course with me, hopefully you'll be able to, either redirect people to this when I post it on Insta or on YouTube, Or, you can just have hard conversations when someone's like, oh, yeah, I'm trauma bonded with this person. And you can ask questions and get to the bottom of it, whether or not they're really trauma bonded. Because as you can see, if there's been actual abuse, my approach to somebody that's been through abuse, we've got to heal the roots of that abuse and how that hurt before I can get to any other work. But a person that's mutually dysfunctional, I start looking for self-awareness stuff first. That's the very first thing I start looking at. Because I've got to figure out where you've made mistakes and where we need to learn how to be better because we're in dysfunction. Whereas abuse, I've got to heal the abuse first. I got to heal the effects of that before I can do any work on the self side. Okay, so I have to approach it differently. So hopefully you guys can help other people understand what a trauma bond really is, what a trauma bond is not, what mutual dysfunction kind of looks like, what codependency is, so that way you can stop them from using these terms that just don't apply for what they're going through. But that's all I got for you guys today. Hopefully you guys got something out of this. We should be back to doing some pretty good content this week. I got a couple reels coming out. I'm going to do things a little different in the coming weeks here. I've got a couple reels I'm working on that are going to be a very different feel to them, not just me talking at the camera, more just kind of talking about some things in pop culture that have really hit me pretty hard lately, and some movies I've watched and some things I've gone through. So I want to get that stuff out to you. But other than that, everybody have a great rest of your Sunday evening. Spend the time with your mothers. If you haven't let your mother know already, happy Mother's Day. To any mothers I have in my program right now, happy Mother's Day to you as well. Go enjoy the rest of your day with your family. But as always, stay safe, keep the faith, and never let them grind you down. Thanks, guys.